Hi all, for our notable game today, let's look at another amazing clash between Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov. This game today is game 27 of the original first match, which went from 1984 to 1985. This game was after 17 draws in a row, where Karpov had led 4-0 against Kasparov. Karpov just needed to reach 6 points to win the match. So Kasparov playing black here. Game 27, knight f3 from Karpov, and we have d5, d4, knight f6, c4, e6. Kasparov is not playing a hypermodern opening. This is purely classical stuff, occupying the center solidly. Knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5, and now h6 is the most popular move, and usually the bishop drops back here. That's the most popular, it seems. Bishop takes f6 is the second most used move here. So white voluntarily giving up the dark square bishop. e3. Kasparov castles. And now we have queen c2 in this position. Often rook c1 is also played. c5. Trying to extend that bishop, which is black's trump card in the position. White's given up his dark square bishop. So black is trying to blast open this diagonal quite frequently. So this is the move which is most used. D takes c5, and now d takes c4, bishop takes c4, queen a5. Black is threatening to just regain the pawn, or maybe consider capturing on c3. In fact, after castling here, we have actually bishop takes c3, denting white's pawn structure, so suspending the recapture of this pawn until later, because after queen takes c3 the queens are coming off. Kasparov didn't want to play queen takes c5 in this position, and the most common move here is in fact queen takes c3 according to Livebook, not queen takes c5. 28 games for taking on c3, only 2 for taking on c5. I think this might be playable, and get something like this, where whites might have a tiny edge. So that's playable as well. But we have queen takes c3 here, b takes. So black is technically a pawn down in this position. He wants to regain his pawn, and he plays the move knight d7. Karpov now creates a fracture in black's pawn structure. Can you guess what he plays? If I give you 5 seconds here, what would you play with white? Okay, c6. So it creates a fracture. The pawn cannot be left. It's going to take on b7. So it's taken. So Karpov has isolated these 2 pawns, and you might think, well, this is just symmetrical, isn't it? And we've even got the same pieces, same colour of bishop, light square bishop, same pieces, same pawn structure on both sides of the board. Why would Karpov want to play like this? White has a small initiative though in this position on the queen side. His bishop's better than black's bishop. The knight's kind of a little bit better than black's knight. This knight threatens more aggressive squares to attack the c6 pawn. Black can't do the same to white's pawn here. So the mining pieces are slightly better for white in this position, and the rooks also show they're slightly better after rook a b1. Controlling that b file makes it difficult for black to unravel. In this position, Kasparov chose knight b6. If he plays something like rook b8, then maybe just taking, and then knight e5 shows the power of that knight being more aggressive than black's, and c6 pressure. And if c5 now, rook b1, and all of white's pieces are actually getting better than the black's 3 pieces. So say knight d7, and if there's an infiltration to the 7th rank, then this could lead to a loss of a pawn, which is not very pleasant. So it's actually a tricky position for black at move 15. Knight b6, hitting that bishop. Bishop just drops back to e2 here. Now this bishop's hemmed in. The knight's still threatening to come to e5 or even d4 potentially. The pawn is moved here to c5, so a slight difference in pawn structure now in terms of that pawn now on the fourth. Now a very, very interesting move is played in this position. Very, very interesting indeed, which I don't think many players would entertain that much, but I think it's one of the great prophylaxis moves of the match. When we think about prophylaxis, to remove problems in advance, really Karpov would like to attack the vulnerable pawns. He's got a slight initiative on the queen side. John Nunn has written about weaknesses and how they're exploited. It's often the side with the initiative which is in a better position to exploit issues. You actually physically need pieces to exploit structural issues. And here, with the rook placed here, it's ready actually for action in theory to hit both pawns. If it went to a5, it would simultaneously hit both pawns. Rook b5. But rook b5 in this position is fraught with issues for the moment. If rook b5 was played immediately, then bishop a6. Ouch. This diagonal. Yes, just losing material. Now you might wonder, okay, but this next move is kind of amazing and very, very deep. I'm not even going to ask you to guess it. I'm just going to show you it. Rook fc1. Why would you want to place a rook behind a pawn? Because it might be important to be able to play c4 later. It might be important to play c4 later, protected by the rook. And here black's not really doing that much in this position. We have black playing bishop b7 now. And another great move, just improving the position slightly, will be the removal, the reduction of an unprotected piece. And Karpov plays king f1, just protecting the bishop. If he played rook b5, this is desirable in theory, but in practice it runs into bishop a6 again. So the bishop would just have to retreat back. So king f1 protects this bishop. So white really is gearing for rook b5 in this position. And it's not something black can do. The rooks are stuck at home at the moment. So this rook's having a while of the time in this position. We have bishop d5 here. No, bishop d5. And now rook b5 is finally played. So black is under pressure here. And one point here is on bishop takes a2. Better than taking on c5 is just to trap the bishop with c4. And then rook c2 to follow would actually trap the unfortunate bishop. So it shows rook c1 in advance against the a2 being weak and subject to attack. So here knight d7 is played, and now the rook reaches an ideal location, not only protecting a2 from the bishop but hitting the weak pawns. So the black pieces are starting to be a little bit more miserable, like defending just pawns, a whole rook defending a7 here. And the attacking piece is threatened continuing now with c4 just to evict it from d5. We have rook fb8, and it is served its eviction notice with c4. Bishop c6. Now how to bear more pressure on c5? Well, knight e1 is played. And you see it's an advantage that the bishop's actually protecting the e2. The king is protecting e2. So if something like here, then knight d3 looks good. And I just want to check something here. This tactic, actually, Let's just check this tactic. Bishop takes g2, no, is playable in this position. Pardon me. Pardon me. On rook b2, there might be something actually just better here. Actually, knight d3 might be playable, but there's also consideration of f3. The engine actually gives this, and not minding bishop takes g2. This position, if the rook is forced here, then there's another kind of trap of the rook actually. So even that tactic kind of backfires. Yeah, if white's gonna win the exchange, black would have to give up the exchange. So that works. Let's turn it off now. So yeah, that seemed to be taken care of, the tactical possibility. I mean, rook b2. So instead, rook b4 is played, and now the situation here, if knight d3 was played immediately, which looks very tempting, then black has things like rook a4. So in fact, bishop d1 is played, cutting out rook a4 in advance. So there's a lot of prophylaxis for black's pieces not to be able to interfere with the pressure on these pawns. That's the key theme. But trying to do that without interruption from black's tactical possibilities. The rook goes back to b7. And now again, it's really tempting to play knight d3. The thing is, this could run into bishop e4 here. Again, giving black some active counterplay is not something desirable like this. Even if black gives up a pawn and gets some active piece play, it's not desirable. So in fact here, f3 is played, taking out of the equation bishop e4. We have a large number of prophylaxis moves in a very simplified position. So it's a kind of model game, the kind of prophylaxis you'd want to do to be able to torture some isolated pawns. This game is like demonstrating quite vividly here. We're reaching an optimal point where this bishop really hasn't been given e4 or a4. The rooks have been given an empty token file which they can't really do much with. And knight d3 is now on the cards, torturing the c5. The bishop's actually in the way here, trying to protect c5. We have rook d8. And this is the point where, yeah, knight d3 is played. And black is losing a pawn without being able to generate any naughty business. Basically, black is losing a pawn, or is that the case? Black plays g5. Wrong. White doesn't take the pawn on c5 because there is still some naughty business to attend to or be worried about. Can you guess what white plays now? This is a prophylaxis move, but you might be able to get it. So instead of taking the pawn, you need a prophylaxis type move against black's active possibilities. Note, the knight is controlling b2 here to stop an invasion on the 7th rank. So what does white play? If I give you 5 seconds starting from now. Okay, bishop to b3. Yes, we want to win the pawn, but under the most favourable conditions possible. If that requires a bit of patience, if that requires prophylaxis moves, then so be it. You want to create the most favourable conditions for winning material without any counterplay, any naughty business, any active pieces, any infiltrations. All of that, you want to rule out those conditions, which are kind of negative. And now it seems very, very safe to take the pawn. Like in Marathon Man, the quote, "Is it safe? Is it safe?" Karpov has made it safe, it seems, to take on c5. And after king f8, finally, on move 27, in game 27, on move 27 in game 27, he goes up material, knight takes c5. He's a pawn up. Knight takes, rook takes. Hitting the bishop. Protects the bishop. Kasparov protects the bishop. King e2. King e7. And now a ruthless move, simplifying rook d1. Rook takes. King takes. And now king d6 protecting the bishop here. Rook a5. Still putting pressure on the isolated A pawn. Now Kasparov plays f5 after king e2. Slightly ambitious move, looking h5. It puts 3 pawns in a row here. Kind of skewerable. Can you see a kind of little tactical move that's played now against these 3 pawns by Karpov? Perhaps of interest might have been to consider g4 here, but even so, if takes and g3 to get away from the light squares, this is quite favourable for white. So anyway, h5 was played. So what does white play here if I give you 5 seconds, starting from now? Okay, e4. Yeah, putting the pressure on the 5th rank. The rook hasn't just won a pawn, it's actually in an active location for the 5th rank. Especially now that Kasparov has put his pawns on the 5th rank, 3 of them. We have f takes e4. F takes, bishop takes, and rook takes g5, so there's a weak pawn here now to target. Bishop f5 setting a little trap. If rook takes, then bishop g4 check is not very amusing. So we have king e3. The king wants to help the c pawn as well. So the pawn is now threatened. h4, king d4, threatening c5 check. e5 check is played. King c3, bishop b1. a3, getting the pawns off the colour of the opponent's bishop. Rook e7. We have rook g4, and the pawn goes forward, and it's tempting just to win the pawn, but there's a nice alternative here, just g3, with the idea that maybe rook h4 under more favourable circumstances to win the pawn, because if the pawn was taken here, then maybe something like bishop f5 is annoying, and it's reducing the pawn potential. It's nice to have connected pawns anyway. So g3, but it does seem to imply that this pawn, you know, is a little bit dangerous. Coming to queen. Now Karpov maybe has calculated stuff related to this danger pawn in advance, that his bishop is actually on the same destination colour. So if later his bishop can go to d5 or c6, it's covering the destination of the pawn. So the career potential of that pawn has been maybe evaluated even here for this move g3, because it's strange. Many club players, I'm sure, would not want to leave the h3 pawn. But rook e8, rook g7, now hitting a7. If the pawn on h3 is gone for, then rook f8, and there's a little bit of counterplay after takes. Check this position, bishop e4. Maybe there's a little bit of counterplay, which is a nuisance. You can imagine the king and the rook and bishop actually being potentially coordinating here. So okay, we have rook g7 instead, just going for a7. Rook f8, and now yes, it does seem as though black is getting a potentially dangerous pawn here. We have rook takes a7, rook f2. The point is though that if the career prospects have been evaluated, then Karpov believes that his pawn might be more significant. So he's gearing his pawn now with check. Rook takes h2. It does seem to be playing with some risk. Why would white, in his right mind, allow this pawn, which is only 2 squares from queening, after masterfully cutting down all the options after winning the pawn on c5? Well, it's all about this c4 pawn. It can roll with check now. King c6. Now check here, and note the bishop's got a key square to try and stop the future queen. King d5. Check. The king goes to e4, and now it's with check as well, the bishop c6 possibility. So Karpov aware, he's thinking that this pawn is more significant actually. c6, it's 2 squares away. Check, unblocking the pawn, only 2 squares away. King a5. But here, with an idea of bishop c6, It's futile to play h2 in this position. Kasparov plays rook b8. If he plays h2, c7, there's no checks here. And if queening, we play bishop c6 check, winning that queen. So rook b8. Has Karpov fully evaluated that this pawn is better than this pawn? c7. Rook c8. King b6. King goes to e3, away from at least from a check. Bishop c6, and the tragedy here for black is even if the bishop's blocked, it creates a weakness of the last move. If the bishop's blocked, that gives the possibility of the rook coming behind the pawn, because this diagonal is then blocked. So it seems e4 isn't so useful as you might think. There's always rook h7, which there isn't currently in the position. We have h2. We're getting to a critical climax of both passed pawns reaching potentially their destinations. But here, Karpov uses his passed g-pawn, which is a little bit better than this pawn. The unfortunate tragedy with this pawn, it's blocked by the king at the moment. g4. Kasparov plays rook h8. We have rook d1. Hitting the bishop, and this is fully controlled. The h1 square now. Bishop a2. Check. King f4. Karpov actually dissolves potentially these two pawns. He plays check. Well, he's going to dissolve this one anyway. King g3. Rook takes e5. Still with an eye on h1. So if queening, we just take. And we're going to queen this pawn. So the pawns are dissolved here, the e and g pawns. Rook e2. Hitting the bishop. And here, Kasparov resigned. He's going to be losing his h2 pawn. Let's have a look at this final position. If he moves his bishop, rook takes h2 is possible because of the queening. With check as well. Where does the bishop go? If he queens, we just take this. If that bishop moves, king b7 will herd the pawn. With check, black hasn't even got bishop e6 here to stop the pawn. So with this game, Karpov went into lead 5-0. He only needed 6-0 to win this first World Championship match against Kasparov. Kasparov here was in arguably the darkest abyss of his entire chess career. It would be like a humiliation in a way to be wiped out 6-0. And this was a game played with minimal risk for White. It just seemed as though White had slightly more active pieces, a symmetrical pawn structure. But what did Karpov do with his pieces? He made sure that he achieved the perfect climactic conditions for winning the c5 pawn. Cutting down against bishop a6s, bishop e4s, any rook infiltrations. That bishop b3 stopped the rook infiltrations of rook b2, so he created the perfect conditions for winning c5. But then the subsequent play, once he'd created the c-pawn, the celebration of that passed c-pawn seemed to entail some risks for allowing black a seemingly dangerous h-pawn only 2 squares away. But Karpov perhaps had looked further and thought he could actually quite easily manage that h-pawn with his bishop on this diagonal, and his c-pawn would prove more significant. So a very, very interesting game there, showing some great prophylaxis in a simplified position. Some players have said, Karpov has among the greatest number of tournament victories when he defaulted the match against Fischer, the World Championship match, he was defaulted as world champion. And he wanted to prove himself, and he had an energy conservance method of play. He would often just win with an extra pawn. He didn't need brilliant attacks. He didn't used to use too many mental resources. Technique chess, energy efficient, and that helped him win many, many games in tournaments when he became by default the world chess champion. And this is a game which seems quite energy efficient, but it seems as though that there are some interesting questions. Was it really needed to allow black this dangerous pawn? But it seemed to be well managed, the way this game was played. Very well managed. So Kasparov 5-0 at this point, 23rd of November 1984. Okay, I hope you got something from the game. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.